Hello everybody and welcome back to Dev, the podcast about everyday video game developers and why they do what they do every day. We're back with Season 2, Episode 2, continuing on the trend of interviewing folks I've never met before. This time with a veteran designer, Mark Acero, someone who actually reached out to me following Dev Season 1, listening to that and enjoying the content and was keen to get involved. And here he is. This is a discussion with someone who's got a fascinating career across design and across other aspects of design, pushing himself into different disciplines with roots back to the origins of Evo. I was kind of excited to hear that he'd been a part of that original fighting game crew on the West Coast. Knew a lot of the folks from Evo, which was super cool. But I think this conversation dives into topics around crunch, around putting yourself into different disciplines to challenge yourself and expand your repertoire, how an understanding of combat design is so useful for gameplay mechanics in general, something that I think I resonated with very much given my background. So yeah, I think another really interesting conversation with Mark. He's very open, shares a lot of his history, gives great insight, and I really enjoyed it. Just a reminder, Dev is on Patreon. If you didn't catch Season 1, all of Season 1 is archived there if you join at the lowest tier. If you join at the highest tier, you also get video versions of all of Season 1 as well as video versions of Season 2 as they come live. Obviously, all of Season 2 audio is free as normal as Season 1 was when it started. Just a reminder, please support the show if you can. It would really help me out. But anyway, without further ado, let's go on to my conversation with Mark Acero. So sit back and listen in. This is Dev. So yeah, if you'd just like to introduce yourself and yeah, who are you?
Hi, I'm Mark Acero, game designer for 26 years. Worked as many different kinds of game designer, but definitely specialize in combat design.
Yes, yeah, you've got a fascinating career, Mark. All kinds, very similar to mine, all kinds of different design aspects, and I'm excited to dig into that. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. Another person, this is the first time we're meeting, so I appreciate you jumping on the podcast with me and having a discussion. And I always like to open it with my favorite question: what first inspired you about video games?
All right, I'm really going to date myself here. But it was like some of the very first home consoles. So my parents brought home the Atari Pong and the Atari Stunt Cycle. Most people have not heard of Stunt Cycle. Think Evel Knievel doing jumps, but with like handlebars and your right hand, what's the proper term? Rotated the handlebar for the gas, and that's how you play the game. And I really distinctly remember how it was even first described to me, which is like, it's like a game that you play on TV. So it's like you're controlling the TV. And so someone who was like 3 or 4 years old, just like, I can control the TV? Like, no way, let me get into this. And I loved it and spent, thereafter spent time of like game, It was natural for me to like figure out how things work because I understood this controller affects the thing on screen, and now start to dissect the gameplay. So even though like my brother was 3 years older, like I was just always good at video games. Like I always beat up the big kids or played longer. We would take trips to Las Vegas. I'm a Californian by most of my life, so quick trips to Vegas we would do like over the weekends, and parents would leave us alone, give us $5 or $10. We'd go to the arcade for X amount of time, and he'd always run out of money well before I would. So yeah, I just loved it, I guess is the real answer. Like it's literally one of my earliest memories is playing video games.
Right, and like you said, that kind of connection of being able to control something on the television, rather than it being a passive medium, it suddenly becoming an active medium, and that hooked you right away. I love that idea of one of the first peripherals, right? The first gameplay controller peripherals. That's so cool. And yeah, so you mentioned you had a brother. Like, where did you grow up? You grew up in California, yeah?
Yes, Southern California. I was born up in the Bay, but mainly grew up in SoCal. Yeah, he's 3 years older, but mainly grew up in a city called Duarte, and then we moved to Yorba Linda middle of my freshman year, which is in Orange County.
Yep. Okay, cool. So video games kind of hooked you very early on. when you went to school, did you have a friend circle that were gamers? Did you find the gamers, or were you the only gamer? Like, how did you kind of grow up around games?
Well, just as kids, like, yeah, I always had a buddy or two that like played, the early, Nintendo games with me or whatnot. Um, Sorry, but one quick thing I have to mention is it's really funny because um, I was such a love playing video games that like my parents quickly learned that they couldn't just ground me. They had to take away like the adapter to like my Nintendo to actually punish me because like, oh, I don't go out to play with my friends. That's okay. I'll read my comic books or I'll play my home consoles all day long. So yeah, sorry. I always had friends that would want to play. Like even on my street, there was a bunch of older kids, and we'd all play games at each other's houses. And leading up to like high school, this is a key part of like my how I got into the games industry, which is in high school, Street Fighter came out. So my sophomore year was the first time I ever ditched school, and it was to go to the liquor store to play Street Fighter. And I was one of the early tournament players in fighting games. So all the lead up to what is now the Evolution tournament were all people that like I had played with in California in the very early days. I was a part of like the first documentary about Street Fighter players called Bang the Machine. It never officially got released, but the Evolution tournaments will play it every couple of years, and they'll have a screening of it.
Right, and is that there was a famous arcade, was it not Gatorland, was it? There was a famous arcade in California where...
Southern Hills Golfland or Camelot?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, where a lot of that's sort of where the fighting community really grew up, kind of in California. Yeah,
definitely in the big tournament hotspot, especially when you know some of the bigger names like Alex Valle. Like we were all Southern Hills Golfland based. Then in the Bay Area, it was Milpitas Golfland. Those were like the two big hubs of tournament players in Northern and Southern California.
That's right. Oh, that's so cool. So Street Fighter was in your blood then. Street Fighter was something you fell in love with, and
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and that I presume that inspired you then. Not only from playing it, but when did you sort of make that connection between falling in love with the game and playing it and wanting to make them?
Oh, just I always like even as a little kid, my parents would again when I date myself like 70s and 80s, my parents asking me what do I want to do. I'm like, oh, I want to make video games. They're like, yeah, okay. And if you can't do that, what do you want to do? Because, translation, that's not a real career. So what else can you do? What do you want to do? Which was actually going to be psychology, which I want to mention because I still utilize my knowledge of psychology in developing games for the players, as well as how I deal with the teams that I develop the games with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, psychology is a really useful aspect of design. So yeah, interesting that you study that. So talk me through that kind of journey from high school, Street Fighter, through college, presumably, like, and into your first role. Like, how did that flow?
So from the tournament player playing fighting games, started doing strategy guides, even had a job it was Square Enix at the time. So Squaresoft's publishing branch in the States was, actually it was Square EA when I got hired. And then it turned into Square Enix, shortly afterwards. Which was technically my first job in the game industry. I was a game counselor / tech support. So the 900 line that would charge $1.75 a minute, I was answering and helping people beat their Squaresoft games. And then of course, throughout this whole entire time, from high school, throughout college, I was going to tournaments, and a Northern Cal buddy of mine, a brilliant game designer named Ben Curitin, he one day was like, hey, Mark, we're making some fighting games here. Do you want to join us? And of course, I jumped at the chance, and I've been very fortunate to spend the rest of my life making video games thereafter. So I've literally spent over half my life making video games.
Love that. And so literally from being in that community, then being in that fighting game community, that's what got you the opportunity to go and, that dream you'd had since you were a kid, which I will say is rare. I'm not sure. There are lots of folks I think that never, like myself, never associated. Like, I love games, but I'll never get to make them. But the fact that you had it from day one is so cool. And then you were able to parlay that into an actual role through your love of the fighting game community. That must have been. How did that feel when that happened?
Oh, I I cherished it so much that I put my all into it. So I stopped competing because I wanted to concentrate because this is what I want to do for my life. I can always join a tournament later on. I won't be as good, but that was always a side option that I can always go back to. But like, this is what I want to do for my career. Funny thing is, it was also around the same time like Eminem, Lose Yourself came out. So that was like my theme song as I was crunching late at night, like, you only live once, when opportunity knocks, you gotta, I won't butcher the song, but that just, all that together was like, I'm going to put my heart and soul into this. And cause I want this to be my career. And that was before, EA Spouse. And so there was times when I was crunching, I was literally working 120 hours a week. I had a little fold out bed that, I'd work until really late at night, fall asleep, wake up, get back to working again, go home for lunch and, shower or eat. And then, but that's what I was doing back then because that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, so you grabbed that opportunity with both hands. And was that Paradox?
Yes, Paradox Development.
And so you went straight into a lead role. Is that right? When you joined Paradox, your sort of first real role in the industry was lead?
Oh, no. I was a game designer on a couple, one, two, three. I think I did 3 projects before I became a lead. Game development back then was a lot shorter than it is nowadays. Starting from the original PlayStation, you're looking at more like a 6-month dev cycle. 9 months on a longerish side type of thing.
So okay, so you're making fighting game, right? Action fighting games, right? You're especially the X-Men Next Dimension and Mutant Academy, right? You're kind of getting to do the thing you wanted to do. And you're still young at this age, right? Relatively. So how did that go? That you grabbed the opportunity with both hands, but transitioning from being a designer to now leading people and taking on more responsibility. How was that transition for you? How did that feel?
We ended up hiring like a lot of our own buddies because obviously there wasn't that many people who, if you're going to make fighting games, you want people who understands fighting games. Because I will say like fighting game players are some of the most educated player base out there because they're paying attention to frame counts and, recovery times. And, you don't do that in a lot of other games. You aim and you shoot or you jump from platform to platform, but fighting game players gets into the science and dev knowledge of characters so they can eke out every type of advantage that they can. So it all kind of makes sense. So going on to a lead, again, that's where part of taking psychology into account, how you treat people. Part of it is a lot of just who I am as a person, don't care who you are, give respect, get respect, that type of thing. But I also did things like unconsciously, even as a junior designer, that I now can talk about of like, which is, like some of the best ways to make games is collaborating. And so here I am, naive, junior game designer, and I'd have an idea. But instead of like talking directly to my lead about it, I wanted to, find out from other people hey, is this a good idea? So, hey, let me talk to my animator about it. And, he'll poke some holes. We'll discuss it. We'll cover up those holes. And what I did, which now sounds so, back then was so groundbreaking, which is in that conversation, I'd also get the estimates of like, hey, so how long would it take you to do this? And then I would do the same process with my engineer or the gameplay engineer who would most likely implement it. So then by the time I would talk to my lead designer, oh no, we can't do that. That's going to take too long. Well, actually, the animator said 2 days, not a week. Oh, and then what about engineering? That sounds really expensive. Actually, he only thinks 3 days and not 2 weeks. Oh, well, yeah, then we should try it out. We should do it. And so it became a collaborative process. It made the design stronger because each conversation I had, they poked the holes. They said where it fails at. So we've talked about it. We talked it through, made the design stronger. The other part that I loved about that is it stopped being my idea. Instead, it became the team's idea. So now I know the team's backing me on this idea because it's our idea. We know the estimates, all the holes are, the majority of holes are covered, until you get it in game. And then, so I have a high track record of things that I designed that gets, turned into full working features, type of thing.
Huh. And I mean, it took me way longer to learn that than you did, Mark, by the sounds of it. Like, where do you think that comes from? Do you think that comes from you, your personality, who you are? Did you pick that up just instinctually on the job? Like, how did you adapt to that?
Part of it, I mean, definitely a lot of that is my personality. At the same time, like at the end of the day, I want to make the best game that I can make. If my name's on it, I want it to be good. I want people to enjoy it and celebrate it. And so, you combine, those things together and so it just became a natural thing for me, to do. I can now later, dissect a lot of what I was doing unconsciously. And, a large part of that is understanding, here's where psychology comes into play. I understand how bias works. Bias makes you interpret events that fits your belief system. The other part of bias is it makes you remember things that fit your belief system. So the example I give as I try to mentor, junior designers or other teammates is like, say we do a play test of 10 people and, you believe something, me and you have conflicting ideas about X. But when you and I watch the play test and I'll see and I'll remember 2 people who did the thing that I said was going to happen, and I won't remember 4 players doing the thing that you said would happen. So by the time you and I would talk about it later on, I'd be like, no, I saw multiple people doing the thing that I believed, which is where playtest data is very, very helpful for the game development process because of bias, because you and I are only going to remember what we saw that fits what we think. And so then we can look at the data and it's like, oh, well, 4 people said what Alex believed, 2 people said what you believe. Therefore, hey, we should do what Alex says, because in that playtest sample size, that had the majority of quote unquote votes to go that way. So understanding my own personal bias of what I think is going to be the best and the right solution, I always have that psychologist step away from it. So I don't ever believe I'm right, or I don't ever believe my idea is the best idea. I do have a ton of arguments why I think this is the right idea to do it, and we'll have that discussion. I don't guess at game design or mechanics. I always have a reason, and but what you can never anticipate properly is how the player is going to react to it. There could be a good paper or academic reason to select one idea over another, but until it's in players' hands and how they're going to experience it, I want to emphasize that point because I feel like a lot of developers are like, no, I feel like I'm a good representation of the playing audience. It's like, no, you're not, because guess what? You make video games, so you are far more tainted than someone who just plays video games do. So again, understanding bias and working around it to help you achieve the results you want to have, which is, a hit and people just having fun.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, it's certainly, like you said, the sort of psychology angle that you've come at things from, both from your education and the way you've kind of used that, leveraged that, does make makes a lot of sense how you approach things, the way you approach them right from the start. That's super cool. I love that, and I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, playtesting can be an incredible benefit and an incredible weapon, right? It can be misused horribly, and it can be incredibly beneficial if you use it right. So, okay, so you sort of mentioned it up top. You've sort of done a lot of design, right? And it does sound like combat design, is definitely perhaps your passion, right? Is the thing that you love the most. But when you shifted to Heavy Iron Studios, you shifted over to level design. So how was that transition? How was that transition for you?
I first want to tell you why.
Go for it.
My first lead designer switched over to being an engineer. So that confused me. I'm like, why'd you do that? Like, do you not like being a game designer? Like, we're living the dream, that type of thing, right? And he's like, well, Mark, think about it. Like, we make fighting games, and that's a very niche field in the games industry. So if something were to happen, or if the genre dies, which it did for a while before it came back up, where are you going to work? The only other North American studio that makes fighting games is Midway out in Chicago. Are you going to move to Chicago? So, and so that got me thinking. So that kind of freaked me out. So I'm like, oh, he's right. Like, if my long-term goal is to be a design director, then like, I should make sure I work as all the different kinds of game designer. So that way I've got the experience and knowledge on how to be successful in each of the specialty fields. So that was a big part of the first half of my career, which is working as, and of course, when I first started, there was just game designer. All those subdivisions didn't exist. Level design was one of the first splits, game designer and level designer. Then my position afterwards was a systems designer, but I'm getting really nerdy. But even then, what people call a system designer today is different than what a system designer was back then. Nowadays, system means progression and gameplay loops and retention. Back then, it just meant, a game system that was within the game beyond a singular, mechanic. What was the overarching systems that control what the gameplay is, which is why I would used to always tell combat designers, like, the best combat designers are system designers with combat or 3Cs, character, camera, and controls, specialty knowledge, and those are the best combat designers because you're thinking systematically in how your each design affects the whole ecosystem. Like, I really talk a lot about holistic game design when I teach and how I develop. Sorry, did I answer your question? I felt like I went on my story mode.
I think you actually answered that question and my next question, because you mentioned trying to diversify your skill set, right? So you level designer at Heavy Iron, and then scripter at the Collective. So I'm guessing I'm guessing that was a continuation of like trying to broaden out your skill set, yeah.
And I do want to mention, like, I got lucky with level design at Heavy Iron Studios. I was making The Incredibles. And I say that because I immediately got to work on different kinds of environment. Most games, it's like, oh, it's all city, it's all jungle, and because it was The Incredibles, I got to do level platforming, jumping with Mr. Incredible on the city rooftops. I got to make a racing style level using Dash, who's running on the water with the slower turns and movements. I also got to design for Dash and Vive, the Incrediball force field ball, which was more like a skate. So having to even create levels for those 3 different types of locomotion styles and abilities, it was a great crash course into level design and pacing and understanding the mechanics and what the player can do and how that affects how you do level design.
Yeah, that sounds like a great, opportunity. Especially, did you feel you were kind of slightly out your comfort zone when you took that role on, and was that? I mean, it sounds like that was part of the challenge, yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons again why I wanted to go there. The other part, and part of the reason why I got the job is um, what is now called combat design. They didn't have anyone there that did it because, the previous title was SpongeBob. And so, sure, there's a hit, but it's like, a singular 360 hit, not like, Mr. Incredible throwing combos and with taps and hold button presses. So that was part of the reason. So even though my job was level designer per title, I still did combat design because I did do Mr. and Mrs. and Mr. Incredible and Elastigirl. Their implementation, the move sets, the things like that. I was still in my comfort zone, but I got to go and learn a whole bunch of things. Um, do you mind if I give you another
By all means, go for it.
crazy old school dev story? Um, So back then, no studio really had a sound team. They always would like outsource a bunch of sound bank, and then you'd get it in, and then someone would implement it in the game, usually designers. So we did the very thing, and the guy who we contracted was the guy who did like the first Matrix movie, the sound for it. So he was award winning, did the Matrix. So I was like, sweet, I'm working with that guy. But anyways, so we got our sound in like 2, 3 days before we were going to do like our first media press. The first time the media was going to get to even see the game. So that was like, oh. So I'm saying all this because that was like my record for most hours worked consecutively. Um, I literally worked. I don't want to fudge the numbers. Basically, I worked around like 42 hours straight to implement the sound because it was environmental sound. It was the sound on the characters. It was, ambient, all that, had to be put in on proper frames or on proper, level design cues and the whole shebang. So that was like a pretty insane marathon. I was literally sometimes slapping myself or to wake up. Or Heavy Iron Studios back then was in a circular building, so I would run laps around the floor to wake myself up, then sit back down and go back to work type of thing. So
I love that story. I wanted to zero in on that just for a minute, Mark. As someone, also a victim of many a crunch. Like, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Like, why? Like, why did you do, like, on paper, that sounds madness, right? Like, why would you work 42 hours straight to do anything? Why did you do that?
I'll reference back to the Eminem song "Lose It." Lose yourself. Like, this is still what I wanted to do. Like, I want a game design career. This is what I wanted to do for my career and what I wanted to do for my life. So was it insane? Absolutely. But yeah, obviously as a family man and father, like there's no way I could or would do such things again. But I was single, I was young. Um, if I wasn't working late at night, if I wasn't crunching, I'd probably be at the clubs dancing, and so it's like it was the most productive usage of my time, anyways. And again, it got me helped me develop the skills that I needed to be successful, and it learned a lot of lessons. So that's why, like, now I talk a lot about how to develop efficiently. Like, efficiency isn't something most game designers talk about, but like, of course, every producers I've worked with love me to death because I'm very efficient at what I'm doing. Because most of my career, like, I never worked at Blizzard or Riot, so I always had a deadline that I had to beat. Like, you couldn't just keep noodling until it was ready. Like, no, we're shipping at this date no matter what. So so it was natural for me to. I didn't have to be prodded into it. Again, at the end of the day, I wanted to make a good game. So if it caused me to work extra hours when I was young and single, I didn't have a problem doing it. It's just pure passion is the short answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And desire, right? It's desire, it's passion and desire to show up and do a great job. And, this is the job that you dreamed of doing. So why wouldn't you give it your all, kind of thing? I think I could certainly relate to that. And I would also, I think something you mentioned there that I think might also be relevant is, looking at this part of your career, right, there's quite a lot of IP you're working on, right? Incredibles, X-Men. And I'm guessing those had, like you said, very stringent deadlines, because they are, particularly in that era, right? They were, hey, there's an IP game. You probably don't have enough time to make it, but it's got to come out at this time. Otherwise.
Yeah, they were related to movies. Like, one of my X-Men fighting games, it was the same time the movie was done. This Incredibles, I got to see the Incredible animatics before it was released. So some scenes, they had no hair. So I was watching the same scenes you saw, but they were bald, or all four of them were blondes, or all four of them had their darker hair, like before they all settled into what they now look like. Or some scenes were still hand drawn, but they still had all the dialogue and conversation. So that itself was like worth the experience of like, that's really cool. And I got to see, an animated movie in its multiple stages of development.
Yeah, but absolutely. Yeah. And that sort of, that just fuels the fire. Right. But also I think it teaches you, it teaches you efficiency in that way, right? Like you can't muck about, right? You can't go, no, I think I'm going to throw this away. It's like, no, like we have 3 days to implement this thing. How are we going to do it? Right. Well, we're going to do this, and then we're just going to hard graft it.
Yeah. That's a key point, because, game developers are really, really smart people, and each one of us believes our solution's the right solution, the best solution. So they argue and they want to talk, and everyone's so smart that they can present excellent arguments and whatnot. But that's where it's like, that's the benefit, or why I still believe in hierarchy. Someone make the call, and whether it's the wrong call or not, we'll find out soon enough. It's better than design paralysis of, we can't figure out which one we want to do, so we're just going to keep talking about it until we do it, which decreases the amount of development time, and therefore less iterations, and therefore, not as good of a product. So even if it's the wrong answer, let's make the call. The call should be made with, the best information possible, that will best hit the goals, best production efficiency, and then we try it out, then we iterate on it that way. I really bring that point home, because every studio has always said, yeah, you iterate to make the best product. But I've found there's a lot of studios that don't iterate properly. At a lot of studios, iteration means, hey, let's try this one idea, and if it doesn't work, let's throw that all away and let's try out this other brand new idea, which is like the equivalent of throwing darts on the board blindly. And eventually one might hit the bullseye, and then they got lucky, versus having methodology to achieve the results. And more importantly, to learn. You need to find out what each of those ideas, what worked and what didn't work. And that way you can figure out, can we adjust it a little bit to make that idea work? Or do we really need to stop it and start the new one? And so just having that approach of learning why it worked, why it didn't work, just helps strengthen you as a game designer for your career. Because I talk a lot about, like, you can't copy and paste a solution, whether it's game design, production, or whatever. Like, just because one thing worked at one studio or one game doesn't mean it will fit into your game with, if you think about it as a site, or, let's talk about it as cooking. So even though it is a great ingredient, because of the rest of the dish, it may be the wrong proportion. So you can't just copy this one thing and drop it into this other thing. And I say that even with pipeline processes or production things, because same thing. It's like, oh, well, we did this here and it worked, but that was a different collection of individuals with different personalities. And so maybe that was a group that worked together for X years. So they can skip a few steps because they're used to how each other thinks and how they operate. So then when you try it somewhere else, it's like, why didn't it work? Well, it's a different collection of individuals who think differently. Anyways, rant over.
No, I love that. I mean, I've definitely used that analogy before, kind of the same ingredient, wrong recipe. But I've always framed it under the context of the product and that idea of the team as well, and the pipelines also being part of that recipe. And if you don't have those in the same position, then, again, it might not fit your recipe. I hadn't thought about that. I love that angle. That's really smart. Yeah, so I wanted to move on slightly to so you worked at the Collective for a little bit. You worked at Totally Games on some PSP and Wii games, and then you went to Sega Studios and worked on a couple of games there. How? I mean, I'm guessing you were a big Sega nerd, like I was.
I was hired for Golden Axe, so I will say I was a bigger Golden Axe nerd than a Sega nerd. I always had Nintendo. I didn't actually have Sega systems. I played Sega systems at buddies, and don't get me wrong, there's great Sega games that I am total fans of, but I just wanted to be honest, because it was Golden Axe, which I played a ton in the arcade. That's what I nerded out on. And I really appreciated that studio because now there's, some articles about like the crazy crunch or some of the antics that we did at that studio. But the director who hired me, like, told me like, hey, we had a bunch of juniors. The production went longer than we'd like. We got rid of the juniors, and now we're only hiring senior people to help fix a mess. So we're going to crunch, and I want you to know that up front. And because I appreciated that he told me, I'm going to inherit a mess, and it's going to be some hours. And so I was ready for it, and was ready to work. I was getting older then. I think at that point, I was married and pregnant with my first. Or my first was born during the time that I was at that studio.
Got it. Okay. And so as a big Golden Axe fan, like, how did it feel taking on that IP? Obviously, it sounds like there was already a game in production that you kind of joined, but how did that feel and how did that go?
I mean, it was just exciting because it's like, oh, let's modernize Golden Axe and let's get it, M-rated with, with more blood and guts and, things like that. So yeah, just the whole concept really excited me, but because of all the production issues or scope had to be cut back a lot. Like so my role on the Golden Axe team was I was the designer in charge of all the beasts that you ride and even fight against. Well, obviously, it's a big part of the game and gameplay. Trying to think where I'm going. Oh, so we were intending for mocap to cover all of our humans, so a lot of our hand animators, they were going to get to focus on the beast and the boss fights, since obviously giant proportions of enemies and creatures. But story for another day, or there's an article out there if you want to read it. But things happened where the footage from the mocap shoot wasn't usable. It was far faster because we had, I think it was like 2 animators whose job was intended to convert the mocap and to make it play into usable assets. But it was determined that it was far faster to just make an animation from scratch than to convert what footage was taken. So all my hand animators that was supposed to work with me on Beast and Bosses, all hands on deck. And now, because of course we need all our humanoid animation since you're playing as Tyrus Flair. I think that's her name now. So that dramatically cut scope of what we had intended to do for the game.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a process. I think those of us that've been in the industry for a while, we've always got one of those war stories, right, of a game that at least one that had ambitions that were cut short. Like, how did you manage that process? I mean, you came into a project, as a senior, right? You were brought in for experience, and then you're faced with basically it sounds like an impossible scenario. Like, how did you process that? Like, how did you find, how did you push forward even with those challenges?
It still goes back to my passion. I want to make the best game that I can. Like, it's very simple. You'll hear me repeat myself a lot because I have very simple philosophies that I apply contextually. So, I mean, that's what I was left with. So I know there was some designs or, some of the communication wasn't as expressive as it could have been. So, for instance, we had a combo system that if you timed it right, what we shipped with was same animation, but I think the sword would go on fire, and it would cause a bigger hit reaction and do more damage. So the paper design was still solid in there, but because it was the same animation, and button masher is going to button mash, it's like, oh well, it's the same thing. Like, this is dumb, this is simple, and so even though mechanically it was there, it didn't communicate differently, so therefore people viewed it as a lot more simpler. I'm tempted to go on a rant about journalists back then as well.
Well, I think that the fact that your passion and your desire to, like, these are the cards I'm dealt, I'm going to make the best of it. Like, I think that speaks a lot to who you are. I mean,
Oh, yeah, my lead designer at the time phrased it as like, you have a can-do attitude, Mark, and I appreciate that. Like, what are the circumstances it is? Like, okay, like, you can whine and complain about it, or you can figure out what you can do to make what assets you have be the best that it can. So even though I couldn't have new animations for the properly timed combos, hey, let's at least put on some fire VFX, and we'll still keep the different hit reaction, so things like that. You just try to squeeze in as much as you can with what assets that you have. I'd also say back then, that was probably towards the end of when developers were like sneaking things in or working, doing work that wasn't like scheduled or approved of, type of thing. So we definitely had some of those conversations of like, hey, so, like, because we had intended to do the multiple characters, but development, and we had to make cuts. So now we were going to do one, but even then, for quite some time, we were still talking about, between the other developers, of like, okay, we know it's cut, but like, what does it take to still do the dwarf? Like, okay, well, so we kept on, like, in hushed tones, whispering to each other, still planning on doing the other character. But of course, after a certain point, we even had to be responsible of like, okay, we really won't have time to sneak that on in, type of thing.
yeah, gotcha. Okay, yeah. So after Sega, you kind of jump back into combat, right? Back to you moved to BioWare and work on Dragon Age 2, and then onto Prototype, as combat. So you went back. You effectively went back to combat design. Although it sounds like you've been doing a lot of combat design in between. Was that an intentional? What drove that? Focus back on the sort of main passion that you had from the start.
So I talk about the first chunk of my career was developing skill sets and experience. I'll define the back half as working on what I want to work on, the things that make me nerd out and that get me excited. And so I actually, that is the between kind of Golden Axe, but definitely joining BioWare. The only North American RPG, or them and anyways, but one of the premier RPG makers in the industry, definitely at the time. So, I jumped at that chance. So I got, for me to be able to work with them, it was something very, very exciting. So everything there afterwards were things that made me excited, or that, and so combat was it, So even though I'm fully capable of being a level designer, I like to joke to everyone, it's like, yeah, but level designs work. I have so much respect for level designers because literally they're the last line of defense for the player's fun. Because I twink on all the systems and gameplay, but when the game's about to ship, it's the level designers putting everyone's stuff together to fit the story and they're the ones who put things together at the very, very end of the time. So that's why their crunch at the end of the game cycle is always like the worst. And so thus my joke of like, no, that's work. But what I do is like fun, and it's just how my brain thinks. Obviously I think systematically, so it makes sense that I can excel in the gameplay 3Cs types of fields.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And BioWare, was that in Canada? Which office were you? Yeah.
Yeah, that was the Edmonton office.
Yeah, so you moved to the Edmonton. So how was that? I mean, it sounds like you're married, you've got a kid at that point. Like, how was that for for you and the family to follow that passion?
So that was the my firstborn was my daughter, and so she was 6 months old when we moved to Canada. And I got another story for you. So I'm a California boy. So snow's something you drive to and visit. You don't live in it. So I was very ignorant to many things as it relates to snow. One of them being like, oh, it looks like a nice sunny day. And we were in the corporate temp housing while we were still looking for a place. But there was like a mall, quote unquote, across the street. So we're like, oh, it looks like a nice sunny day. We should go out and, let's go to the mall. Me, my wife, and my daughter and my little hand carrier or whatever. Anyways, blanking out on words and nouns. Then we went out there and my nose was like red and because it was like a super cold day. I later found out like, oh yeah, because it's clear, all that cold just drops and settles there with nowhere to go. The other thing that I learned is, again, being Californian with nice weather, you do things when you want to do things, right? And so, hey, it snowed. Oh, I'll shovel it tomorrow. Like my family was out of town, and so it was just me at home over the weekend. I didn't plan on leaving anywhere. So I'm like, okay, I'll shovel tomorrow, not knowing any better. And of course, by tomorrow, that snow, we had a crazy snowstorm. It was as tall as my RAV4. So I had to like shovel all that snow, work for multiple hours. And it ended up being like the coldest place on earth in a city over 100,000 people. It got to some ungodly negative weather where, the breath turns condensation on your glasses, but it was like almost instantly frosting my glasses. So every like 5 minutes, I had to scrape ice off of my glasses so I continued shoveling the snow. So that was a very harsh lesson in cold weather environments, you need to do the thing right away. There is no waiting for tomorrow or next weekend to do the thing you need to do. So definitely culture shock there.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, big culture shock to the California born and bred. And what about the kind of adapting to not only a new location but also a new culture? Like how did that go? Because that can be an interesting adventure, especially if you're working and your wife's now living in a new city, a new town. Like how did that go for you?
Yeah, there was how do I say it? Some learning curves, or there were some pros and cons to a little bit of everything. I'm a foodie, so anytime I'm in a new city, it's always fun to explore the different food scene. So like there's some phenomenal food in Edmonton. There's a few places I still miss to this day. But at the same time, yeah, culturally, like the way Canadians describe, Alberta is like, oh, it's Texas North. And I'm a California boy, so there was definitely, I'll say living in Edmonton is the most ethnic I've felt. Yeah. So I loved working at BioWare and for Mike Laidlaw, who is my lead on Dragon Age. But I'm like, this isn't the place where I want to raise my family. So then we moved to, Vancouver's called Hollywood North. So yes, that sounds a lot more like California, or it's a lot more like Seattle than SoCal or San Francisco, but it felt the West Coast living and ideas, and it fit. It felt more like home. Like I wasn't the one random Asian walking around. Instead, Vancouver's filled with Asians and Wasians and mixed couples, and so it's like, oh, okay, this feels more natural to me.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of I mean, I guess in recent years with remote work becoming a bit more more viable, right? It's less of an issue, but certainly that part of following your passion, but also having to go work, in a different country with different people, different culture, even if it's, even if Canada and America aren't, same as the UK and America, right? They're not that far apart, but there still is differences, and that can definitely affect the way you settle with the role, the way you can engage with the role, the way you can engage with the team. That can make it, that can add complexity, definitely.
And you even mentioned like my wife, because that was another thing, because uh, being at home, she did some remote work way back then, but like, but she was basically at home, and like, so like those in Edmonton and even Vancouver, like she didn't really have like her own friends group. They were always just like girlfriends and wives of my coworkers, because I got to make friends at my studios, but she didn't. Which is why, like, because where we moved, I'm jumping ahead, but where we moved next was Montreal. Though I'll hear it from one of my friends if I don't say it properly. If I say Montreal, but in Montreal, she made her own friends, and so she was pretty upset when I moved us back to California after working up there.
Yeah, but I think that's an important part of many of our stories, right? Is it's not just a developer like dropped into an office in a studio working on a project, right? We are a network, right? We are a network of family and friends who and their impact on our ability to do our job. And this isn't unique to video games, don't get me wrong, but it's certainly something that in a creative field I've struggled with, right? There's times where you need to be creative, but you're like, yeah, but this is such a complicated personal situation, right? Difficult, don't have friends.
Yeah, it's real life. We're real
Yeah.
people with real families, and and that's like even why I had to leave Montreal. Like, because I worked on Watch Dogs there, and great team. Like, I loved working with that group. But I was in Canada long enough that I either had to become a permanent citizen or get booted. And when I took the job, I was told like, oh, no, we'll be able to get you an extension. Oh, sorry. The key part is going for your permanent residency in Quebec means you need to pass you need to have a proficiency in French. So I was told, no, you'll be able to get an extension, so you'll have more time to learn the language, read and write, the language. So don't worry about it. But politically, when I was there, the Parti Québécois were in power, and they raised that requirement even higher than what it was. And so that freaked me out. So it's just like, do we stay longer and I potentially fail, and then we have to go, and then I'm scrambling for a job? Or, hey, do I put in for a transfer and go to UB San Francisco under controlled situations? Then we can apply for permanent residency. And then, so that was the deal I had with my wife. Is like, no, let's move back. I'll ship this game. And then if you still want to move back to Canada, to Montreal, we can do so. But that way I meet all my obligations. We can get the residency without the French requirement. And then we can just go up there. And we're still here in the Bay Area.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, so that took you onto South Park, and then from there you sort of moved on to a few VR projects. You've kind of shifted that design mentality over into VR. How have you found that transition?
So I was fat, like, in many ways I thought like, because one, I thought or believe the future is going to be, AR, VR, right? So I wanted to jump in early. The other, in particular, what fascinated or interested me is the combination of physicality along with gameplay elements. So I did I mention it? But I am a martial artist, and I was a dancer, and I was heavily involved in theater, in high school. And, again, I mentioned even psychology. So reading body language. So I have multiple interests that interest me in the body and how it moves and what it's communicating. And you combine that with the nerd in me about gameplay and game design. And so combining the two together is like, this has to be the future. This is going to make some very interesting things. So that's why I did that jump. And, again, this was before all the crazy tech layoffs in the last 3 years, but it was always like, well, I'm senior enough that, hey, I can always go back into AAA if this VR thing is a bust or doesn't work out type of thing. So I took that chance and jumped into VR. So that was the motivation for it. The crazy thing is now, especially looking back on it, or little things that I had, is like, oh, it's a whole new field. So everything we know about game design is all out the window, and now we need to rediscover everything. That's partially true, but not in the way that people were saying. Like, good level design is still good level design. So there's still pacing, there's still communication. Where it differs, like this was even good. I was thinking about making this for a like GDC talk, where basically it's the 3 C's that are different, but everything else we know about game design still applies in VR. The 3 C's are different because you are the character, your head is the camera, and your hands are the controllers, so you had to adjust to those different things. The biggest and easiest one to point out to is the camera, because in flat screen games, that's the VR industry term, what we consider traditional games. People always laugh when they hear that, or like, what do you mean by flat screen? That's what we mean. Non-VR gameplay. In flat screen, we can do the camera cut and then give the control back to the player. You cannot do that in VR because that'll make people very, very nauseous and take off their headset. Instead, we're heavily reliant on things like sound, or having something travel from in front of you to where you want them to look at opportune times. So it's either extra scripting or again, a greater emphasis and importance of usage of sound to make the player to look where they need to look, so it doesn't feel like a cheap shot if it ended up being a xenomorph right behind you and killing you type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that framing. Yeah, it's the 3 C's. I mean, it makes complete sense. The 3 C's are the fundamental thing that's changed. I love that. And so you've worked at tactical haptics, and you worked at People Can Fly for a little bit. You worked at Servios, but in between that, you've also done some advisory and some mentoring. And you've kind of mentioned this a little bit, throughout this conversation. Like, why do you do that? What drives you to be on those advisory boards and to be a kind of mentor and a team dynamics consultant and stuff like that?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, the teams I'm mentoring are indie teams in the Philippines. So I'm working with a Philippine incubator called Me Games, MEE, all capital, Me Games. So they're helping fund indie teams to be able to make demos that then can be obviously those demos are used to pitch to published investors so they can get the money to fully make their games. So part of it is, I'm Filipino of ethnic origin. But the other part is like, I learned a lot of lessons the hard way in those times of crazy crunches and working hands-on, and because again, the industry was so new back then that like none of us knew any better. Things that are now easily described weren't back then. So I have all these lessons in me, and so it's in my heart to like teach the next generation. So if someone I design or mentor can learn from me quickly versus something that took me 10 years to learn, then they're going to only be that much better than I am when they're 10 years into their career type of thing. So I absolutely enjoy mentoring designers and managing because of that very thing. I get to teach. Even how I operate as a game designer, I constantly teach the other developers, the engineers, the animators, or, whoever's working with me, because I always explain the reason for the thing, why the design is. So that way, even just at the minimum, they feel confident that like, okay, whether they agree or not, it's at least well thought of. And at the same time, I'm raising design IQ from non-designers. So, again, you get better feedback. It makes everyone stronger. The more everyone knows about everyone else's jobs, the better you can cater your own work for them. So, I talked about, hey, I was a level designer, so I understand the things that the level designer needs from me from combat so they can do their job better. Same thing with animators, artists, engineers, etc.
Yeah, I totally agree. The why can be so important, right? It can give so much so much important context that helps you invest, and and even if it's wrong, you know why you tried to do it, and you can, like you said before, you can adapt and learn from that.
And again, they can help you. So it isn't like my idea and my way. It's like, no, here's the idea. This is why. Can you help me make it better? Can you help me improve it? What didn't work? What worked? That type of thing. So basically, having no egos is a really good way of making good games.
So true, Mark. So true. So true of games. So true of the world.
Yes.
Um, so I have a couple of kind of, as we sort of start to wind this down. If you weren't making games, Mark, what would you do?
Well, I always wanted psychology was what I was originally planning on to doing. I then I went to a school to do computer science, but I don't make money, and that's kind of computer related. And I'm a big nerd, but I now know like no, I wouldn't be the greatest of engineer, programmer type. Anyways, no need to get into that. So yeah, probably something like that. Psychology, something tech. Like I know I can, I can do good enough math for accounting, but I think I would be bored to death and probably wouldn't stick with it type of thing. Um, but you never know your circumstances. So like if that was the only way I could feed my family, then I would do it, just very simple and practical. But what I would enjoy doing, then that's a different ballgame.
Yeah, yeah. So something kind of in the psychology field, is kind of a side passion. That makes sense.
Or martial arts or dancing.
Yeah, there you go.
Like if I would have grown up in this generation, like for sure I would have been like trying to be a UFC fighter and training MMA, obviously low career chances, just like being an actor, which is another thing that I wanted to do when I was younger. But, so yeah, I would have tried to make it in one of these other uh, artistic fields in a different sense.
Yeah, yeah, got it.
If not, then I would do what I would need to make money for the family.
Yeah, there you go. And then throughout your career, and I can relate to this as well. Throughout my career as well, there's been times where it sounds like the job has been very consuming, right? Voluntarily, right? You voluntarily giving yourself over to it, if you like. But has that ever hurt you? I mean, have there been times where you feel like, I probably gave too much, or maybe I pushed myself too far? And if so, how did you handle those?
There is definitely, how do I say it? There's times I've definitely looked back on and it's like, okay, I know I was being taken advantage of. Or like, even if I'm in a studio, if I don't feel like I'm appreciated, then that has made me start to look elsewhere type of thing. Um, yeah, I've always, actually, I think there's only one project where I didn't finish it to the end before moving on. And, uh, that's how bad it was. I was actually, you said, how else did it harm me? Well, I was, mental health, I was having crazy panic attacks, um, or anxiety attacks. And, even when I was first diagnosed as anxiety attacks, I'm like, I didn't believe the doctor because I'm like, what? Like, I've always handled stress well. What are you talking about? Like, because I have a heart murmur as well. So I thought it was all related to my heart. But he's like, no, these are symptoms of anxiety. And, he explained to me what it is and why. And sure enough, after I left that location, I was happy. I wasn't having anxiety attacks anymore. And it's like, oh, yeah, because it was, uh, yeah, it was a very toxic environment. I went there because I was told like, oh no, we believe in empowerment. And the same guy who told me empowerment and you can make decisions was also the same boss that I had that micromanaged me the most in my life. Um, like every little thing was overlooked on, and like it was really crazy. So yeah, I have suffered health wise because of some locations where we're nuts.
Yeah, and I think that's, I think we're very similar. It sounds like in that we've definitely given a huge amount of ourselves because what else would we do, right? That's the thing we love doing and it's our passion. And I think that can be the dark side of that can be, you give more than you should, or to your point, you're not respected enough, or the company's just like, yeah, that's what we expect of you. Like, well done for doing the bare minimum. I'm like, no, I'm killing myself. I'm like, that's, well, you're lucky to be here. Those kind of things start to creep in, I think. And I've definitely had a couple of those in my career, and those are hard to, at the time, they feel like, well, no, this is what I should do. But then you look back on them and you're like, man, that was probably not the right choice.
Yeah, like, oh, I should have left earlier. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and again, you and I are now seniors, so like again, ignoring the last 3 years, but like traditionally we've always had that kind of thing of ability to move on. It's a lot scarier, or the people who can be taken more advantage of are the juniors of today, or especially in this climate of tons of layoffs and whatnot. Like, so any junior, like, no, you should be lucky you have this job, which therefore means there's so much easier to be taken advantage of because there's 100 other kids who want that same job as a junior.
Yeah, and I think when you're doing a job like this that is hard not to love, right? It's hard not to love making video games. It's hard to look on it as being a chore or being hard, quote unquote, hard work, And I think that can be, it's a wonderful thing, but I think sometimes it can really hurt you if you're not careful. Cool. Well, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your time. Fascinating career. I love all the, from fighting games through to, challenging yourself with different parts of, design and, leaning on psychology so much, which is so smart. And yeah, just some incredible experiences you've been through. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I think it's another great, example of what this podcast is all about. And yeah, thank you for sharing your journey, Mark, the developer, Mark, the human, Mark, the person that gets to make video games.
Cheers. It was my honor to be on the show. So thank you.
Thank you.